Good evening and welcome to Worldview, the international affairs show that brings you the views and news that other networks can't or won't tell you about. I'm Alan Mendoza. Our show tonight, Islamic radicalism in the UK. Is British foreign policy to blame? Well, in case you hadn't noticed, last week the long-running debate about attitudes within the British Muslim community once again sprang into life with the publication of a report by the policy exchange think tank entitled Living Together Apart. Among its many conclusions, a seemingly worrying one that there's an increasing radicalisation of opinion among British Muslims, particularly the younger generation, with support for living under Sharia law in significant proportions and also admiration for Al-Qaeda. The report concluded that it was actually multiculturalism, a failed policy to that extent, that was to blame, and this was seemingly endorsed by Conservative leader David Cameron in a speech last week. However, British Muslim leaders have on many occasions previously suggested that it's a worrying disenchantment with British foreign policy that has led to increasing radicalisation. Still others have pointed to developments within the Muslim community itself, or a policy of self-radicalisation. So what is the truth? Well, we're here to find out tonight, and joining me in the Worldview studio, I have author and commentator Douglas Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, and Ruhul Tarafder from the 1990 Trust. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this rather very interesting topic that's sort of just sprung up again out of nowhere. Policy Exchange have, of course, done this report that you've all seen, that I think many people at home have seen as well. I'm going to start with you, Ruhul, because I know you've got strong views on the subject. You've been involved in surveys and such like. Just looking at the survey as such, I mean, what's your view of it in totality?
Well, I think a lot has to do in the way that questions are asked. And, if you're asking somebody about Sharia law can mean a whole range of things. And, it can be something like, divorce laws, things like that. So when people say they support Sharia law, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily saying that we support the beheading of, somebody who's just shoplifted, at the local shop. So there's a lot of context that needs to be put with the questions. And I would actually... I'm not sure, who exactly that the Policy Exchange spoke to, but in the surveys that we've conducted, our figures were in complete contrast to the findings of the report by the Policy Exchange. But unfortunately, when a report is saying something positive, it doesn't seem to get the same kind of media attention.
As a negative one. But just take your point on the framing of the questions. Were your questions framed in a certain other way to get a result? I mean, it's often said that obviously findings are dictated a lot by the questions.
Sure. We think we asked quite open questions just to see, the reasons for radicalisation. And the vast majority, 94% of people said that it was as a direct consequence of foreign policy that they felt that radicalisation has taken place in the UK.
That's interesting. Now, Douglas, you've read the report. A lot of headlines have been going on about certain attitudes among, say, the younger generation. Is it a fair report, would you say? Have Ruhul's sort of questions been answered within it?
Well, it's true that there are always problems with taking surveys. As far as I understand, I'm sorry the authors of the report aren't here, but as far as I understand, they've drawn a fairly wide-ranging and fairly significant in size pool of young Muslims and older Muslims to question. So I don't think that the range of the questions is in doubt. What is interesting is that even if some questions might have been framed in a particular way, I don't think they were, incidentally, but even if they were, the same pattern does emerge in every single question asked. This is, again, this goes through all social attitudes, all attitudes toward the state. The same pattern that crops up time and time again is the fact that it is a young age group, roughly the 16 to 24 age group, that is most radical, most hostile to the British state, most hostile to our foreign policy, most hostile to what I regard as being liberal values which are not open for negotiation.
Right, so that pattern emerges regardless of the questions.
It's there every time.
Craig, you've also seen it. Is that a fair characterisation?
I must say, when I first saw the report, I was taken aback, because I spend a great deal of time speaking with Muslim community organisations, literally been to dozens of meetings with Muslim community activists around the country. And I just don't find those kind of radical extreme attitudes as at all common among young Muslims.
Really?
I certainly agree that younger Muslims are probably on balance a little bit more radical than older Muslims, but that's true of younger people of any society tend to be a little bit more radical than older people in any society. That's not unusual. But it seems to me that there's a need not to over-dramatise or over-headline. The percentage of young Muslims who wish to take any kind of violent action against the state is minimal, absolutely tiny, or who would support violent action is absolutely tiny. And it seems to me that the important thing is, people are perfectly entitled in a democracy to disagree vividly with our foreign policy. They wish to disagree with our foreign policy. Actually, Muslims aren't that different to non-Muslims, because the majority of non-Muslims disagree with our foreign policy too. What we need to do is give people...
94% of Muslims regard foreign policies going in the wrong direction.
No,
and that's a bit, probably more than the general population.
That is more, but it's not massively more.
Yeah, I think the general... Sorry to interrupt. I think the general population is about 67%. So it's not that drastically different. The point that you're making, that the majority of people in the country are, dissatisfied with foreign policy. When it comes to supporting terrorism, it was less than 1% of people who, in our survey, who said that they supported the July the 7th bombings, which again is in quite contrast to a lot of other surveys that seem to suggest a lot higher figure. And one other point I just like to say is that I do a lot of work within communities all around the country, and I've just come back a couple of weeks ago. I was doing a lot of work in Leeds, in Beeston, where the July 7th bombers were from, and in a lot of other areas across the country. And I meet a lot of angry young people, young Muslims, but in terms of supporting terrorist activity in the UK, I've never met anybody who says they, support something like the atrocities of the July the 7th bombings. There's people who are very, very angry and see what's happening in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places around the world, and they would see them as resistance movements and support the resistance against occupation. But that's quite different to supporting terrorism committed here in the UK.
Douglas, you're looking sceptical.
Well, several things. Firstly, generally in surveys carried out in the last few years in Britain, and certainly since the 7th of July, it's usually been around the 2% mark of Muslims polled who approve of or emulate or would themselves say they would take part in an attack like the 7th of July. Now, admittedly, that's a low percentage, but if we're dealing even with 1%, let's say in the margin of error we put it down to 1%, we're still dealing with, in that case, tens of thousands of people living in the British state who are willing to kill other people who live in this state simply for the crime of living in Britain. Now, so that's an important thing to state, first of all. Secondly, on the issue of the general public versus the Muslim community polled on these things, in actual fact, as the Spectator poll showed recently, the general public it is true that over the 50% tend to be critical of the government's policy in Iraq. That's not the same thing as being critical of the government's foreign policy in general. And polls that, if you take Iraq out of the equation, people are far more supportive. And what's more, the Spectator poll showed that although they don't particularly want our present government or a future government to be connected with the American government in such a clear way, the very vast majority of the British public want a tougher stance against Islamism, a tougher stance against the jihad, and want this war to be waged generally harder and better.
I mean, I think the context has been made that, that this is a war on jihad and so on, but for the vast majority of people that are living in Afghanistan or in Iraq, they're seeing this as self-defense against occupation.
No. That's not a fair thing to say. The situation in both Iraq and Afghanistan are different situations, as we know. But the situation in Iraq is and has been for a long time not a war against occupying forces, but now, and has been for a long time, a war against the democratically elected government of Iraq, against the Iraqi people, by insurgents, by terrorists, by religious fanatics and fascists.
Well, that's meaningless propaganda.
That's not propaganda.
It is meaningless propaganda. You can't have a democratic election when you have 150,000 foreign troops in the country.
Why did that not happen? Did 8 million Iraqis not turn out to vote? Did they not turn out?
Are you saying the Germans haven't had democratic elections for years because they've had...
Plainly that's going to skew the results of any election. But
sorry, Craig.
We'll
We'll come back to that. How on earth can you justify that comment?
You can't have normal political campaigning. I mean, all the conditions for normalcy and fair and open election weren't present.
I can tell you there'd been a much less normal election if those troops hadn't been there keeping the peace.
Possibly, but if we can leave Iraq to one side I just want to go back on and say that it is absolutely not true. I have no doubt whatsoever that it's not true. As someone who spends a lot of time in Muslim communities, which isn't true of your average Spectator reader, I have no doubt whatsoever that 2% of Muslims in the UK do not support terrorist violence. The number of Muslims in the UK who would support terrorist violence is tiny. I really don't... 2% of Muslims in the UK there are a million Muslims in the UK. So, but there are not 20,000 terrorists in the UK, or people who actively support terrorism in the UK. And I really do think this kind of fear-mongering does nobody any good, and contributes to this kind of spiral of distrust and hatred that can actually cause the problem that we're all trying to solve. And I really don't think that kind of exaggeration does anyone any good.
Well, Ruhul, I mean, you mentioned the issue of the media, in a sense, never, painting the positive, always looking at the negative. Is what Craig's saying right, in a sense? Does the media blow this out into sort of
I think I would definitely agree with that. I mean, if you was to ask similar questions to the general public, you have, the far right and the BNP in this country. If you was to conduct a survey, you might have 1% of people, within, supporters of the BNP who might be advocating violence towards criminals, but nobody's actually conducted that survey. So
that survey is conducted fairly regularly.
All the time, the focus is always upon the Muslim communities, and just because 1% of Muslims say they, support that, of course, that's, not good, but it doesn't mean that any of those people are going to go out and commit any of those kind of atrocities. It's just, at the end of the day, people responding to a survey. The kind of extreme parties in the UK, like, Al-Muhajirin, Al-Gharaba, they have a few hundred supporters, but, there's so much emphasis and focus put on them as if they represent the general Muslim population and communities, when it's a tiny percentage of people. Even optimistically, their figures would, be about 300 people in the whole of the country, and it doesn't mean that all of them are going to then commit kind of atrocities or anything like that.
I disagree with that. That's an unfair characterization to make the argument. I don't think anyone in the government, anyone out of a tiny extremist group of perhaps the BNP or someone, nobody in government, nobody in politics, nobody I've ever read in the papers has suggested that Al-Gharaba, for instance, are representative of the majority of Muslims or of all Muslims in this country. Nobody's making that suggestion. What does worry people, myself
the media
included,
propaganda
is
often tries to imply that.
But what I'm saying is that what does worry people like me very much is not just the fact that organizations like Al-Gharaba and things exist, but that within the wider Muslim community and in all of the major Muslim organizations in this country, like the Muslim Association of Britain, the Muslim Council of Britain, in these organizations, they're not advocating terrorism, but it's very hard to get them to roundly condemn terrorism. It's very hard, and in fact you will not find a member of the MAB who will categorically state that suicide bombing in Israel is wrong.
I mean, that's a completely different issue that we're looking at, but in terms of condemning atrocities in the UK, every single Muslim organisation has categorically condemned any of the violence that has taken.
In which case, tell me why what is now a party with not just a seat in Parliament, but with council seats in this country, the Respect Party, which I think is just as vile and obnoxious as the BNP, equally extremist organisation, that a senior member of the Respect Party could say on the record, a debate that I was in 2 weeks ago, that the 7/7 attacks were simply reprisal attacks. Now, that doesn't say that she thinks that they should happen again, but we don't really like that language.
I don't think that they, in anyhow, I don't know who that was or whatever, but, I don't think that would have been in the context of justification, but you have
Sounds pretty close.
I don't think so. I wouldn't agree with you there, but I think you have to smell the coffee, and the reality is that as a result of what's happening in Iraq, what's going on in Afghanistan, other places around the world, the injustice of Palestine, what recently took place in Lebanon, it's not a justification, but that is the reasons why the anger is there and why people feel that they can resort to these kind of measures. Now, at the end of the day, when we're using a language, war on terror, long war on this, war on that, if we're saying that, we are at war, then you can't make war and then make the rules to suit. Now, I don't justify...
Well, I've never known anyone fight a war.
I don't justify in any way whatsoever. But the point I'm saying is that people are seeing there's no difference between a suicide bomber strapping explosives to himself and getting on the bus in the UK and a B-52 bomber or a helicopter gunship, blowing up people in Iraq and Afghanistan.
There's a very, very great amount of difference.
Well, for me, terrorism is wrong, full stop, whether that is state terrorism or whether that is terrorism that's conducted in the streets of Britain. All terrorism is wrong, and we can't, pick and choose that we think that this kind of state terrorism is okay, and 650,000 people being slaughtered in Iraq, and we're saying that is okay.
First
what
all,
are we saying? That their lives
not the correct figure.
Secondly,
not the correct figure, and secondly, not being killed. Might add, not being killed by by the forces of this country or America, and don't you dare slur the armed forces of this country as if they have killed 650,000 people. The people being slaughtered in Iraq, our democratic allies and friends being slaughtered in Iraq, are being slaughtered by terrorists in Iraq, not by us.
How many people do you think, how many civilians do you think the British and American armed forces have killed in Iraq?
We have no idea, but we believe that in the initial campaign we'd be talking about several thousand, and then maybe 10,000.
Let's move back a little bit towards the survey. We'll break up the Ruhul and Douglas show for a moment. Craig, looking at the survey itself, I mean, what's underlying it? I mean, that's, I think, one of the questions we would like to know. I mean, Ruhul's independent survey, the different survey, the 1990 Trust survey, suggested that, in a sense, foreign policy is the leading determinant. Policy Exchange have said it's actually multiculturalism. It's a failure to have integrated communities properly. It's this sense, if you like, of distinctiveness that's actually caused this division between people, led to radicalising attitudes. Others have said, it's what's being taught in radical sort of madrasas or within the community itself, people not condemning, something similar to what Douglas said, people not condemning terror, etc. What strikes you as being the reason behind it?
Well, I think all of the above. I mean, frankly, I think anyone who denies that all of those are factors is stupid and is attempting to make a political point rather than genuinely understand the problem. There's no doubt that aggressive foreign policy, which involves invading Islamic countries, causes a tremendous feeling of resentment. That's true. There's also no doubt that that there are people who have their own agenda to stoke up that resentment for their own reasons, which are not good, who have a terrorist agenda. They exist, and they're very bad people. They need to be countered. They feed on it. But both exist. It's also true that we have tremendous social problems, particularly in our northern cities, where, and this is often government's fault, where schools and housing estates and all kinds of things have been able to become entirely segregated and ghettoized, and that has to be tackled. It's quite wrong to solely blame a Muslim community for that. It's actually, often it's the Labour Party's fault, to be quite honest, who've controlled most of these cities for many years, and who deliberately wanted a segregated and separated Muslim community as a useful vote bank for them. So all these things play into each other, but what we've got to do is teach people to take those grievances. And I disagree with our foreign policy just as strongly as any Muslim does, but teach people to channel that into political
radicalisation. I mean,
political action.
Particularly radical, though,
exactly.
have you?
Well, you can be radical without being violent. That's a key thing. They can be as radical as they want. There's nothing wrong with being radical, but to channel that into non-violent political activity, and that seems to me the key thing we have to work on.
I buy into that, but Ruhul, I mean, one of the key issues is, leave aside the foreign policy side, the radicalisation is occurring in terms of an increased sort of religious radicalisation as well. People do, I perfectly take your point, Sharia law is very wide and very diverse. You've got, obviously, dietary requirements, many other things. But this sort of the turning inwards, if you like, of the Muslim community, is that healthy, do you think?
Well, I think, firstly, also on the point of Sharia law, when maybe 2% of the country is Muslim, I don't know why we spend so much time. It's not how can it in any way be a threat to Britain?
I'm talking about within the community itself.
So you was asking...
I'm just saying with it, sort of the greater emphasis on keeping many more of the laws of Islam, for example, within the community, not trying to impose it on others.
Well, I think Muslim identity is something that has grown as a result of what's been happening in the media, and since the bombings and so on, and the kind of focus on Muslims, a lot of young Muslims have been looking at their faith and looking at their identity. And when the situation is where communities have been more marginalized, alienated, polarized, and so on, people will look internally, and as a result of that, people have, many people have decided to kind of, look into their faith and see what it's saying and so on. Is that what you was...
Yes, I think, well, I mean, has the West, if you like, Western liberalism driven British Muslims away?
No, I mean, it's a typically absurd Western point of view, that Western liberal self-flagellating point of view that thinks, it must be our fault. It must be something we've done. Well, if you look at a survey like the one that Policy Exchange has just published, you see quite often young Muslims in particular being polled saying that they, for instance, don't like the fact that people drink in British society. Well, so what? Why do I care? Why should we care that a group of people say they don't like people getting drunk? So what? Go somewhere else. If you don't like drink, go to another country. That's what we do here. It's every single time. There's a very, very worrying statistic in the policy exchange report of the percentage of young Muslims who think homosexuality should be made illegal, and that apostasy from Islam should be punishable by death. Those two things are not open for negotiation by the British state. There's no reason why British people should feel any shame about that. There is every reason why the argument should be taken to people who think that way.
But, I mean, you're allowed to believe that if you want to believe it. It doesn't mean what you're not allowed to do is enforce it. If people can have all kinds of strange political beliefs, it's a free country. What they should do, as long as they accept that, it's not something that is actually going to come for law, and that all they can do is try it, if those are their beliefs. And, for example, I have many, many, many Muslim friends, including people who you would view as quite radical in organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, who are quite radical, all of whom know I drink, and none of them hold it against me. They may think,
they will.
But this sounds like, I mean, Craig, this does sound like one of those old jokes you used to hear in Nazi Germany. Some of my best friends are Jewish, but...
Well, to be honest, at the end of the day, like I say, I work up and down the country, I'm engaging Muslim, but I've never met a Muslim person who says, oh, we should, try and, stop British people from drinking. I've never, ever come across that. So that's why I question the policy exchange, and I don't know who they spoke to, but I really don't accept these figures, and I don't know where they came from, and, it's just not true. It's just not a reality that Muslims in the UK are saying that, well, we want British people to stop drinking alcohol, and that's something that they want to force. It's a ridiculous assumption.
There is one area, though, where, not an attempt to enforce, but there's been strong, I mean, coming back to the foreign policy side, let's go back, we briefly touched upon it, you mentioned it, the sort of Palestine-Israel thing, the Lebanon issue last summer. Who can forget also at the time of that, and then we had the sort of alleged terror plot with the planes at that moment in time. What did we get after that terror plot? We had leading Muslim leaders come out and say, this is because of British foreign policy this has happened.
Yes. And might I add also that during that period, incidentally, poll after poll does show this is not just policy exchange poll after poll in this country shows the percentage of Muslims in this country who regard Jews as being legitimate targets for attack. There's an extremely worrying poll on that last year, which Melanie Phillips highlighted in her book. There's no coincidence between that and those young Muslims who put that into action. Anti-Semitic attacks in Britain alone went up 31% last year. 31%. And the number of Muslim people who are responsible for those attacks are wildly disproportionate for the percentage of Muslims living in this country. That is an example of them putting extremism into action.
Well, one point in terms of the Muslim leaders, it wasn't just the Muslim leaders that were saying about foreign policy. The Joint Intelligence Committee report that was produced for the Prime Minister also said as a result of the Iraq war, that is what has resulted in radicalisation. So it wasn't only Muslim leaders that, had finally, in my opinion, came in and were saying that as a result of foreign policy. But the Joint Intelligence Committee themselves, they said that. In fact, I think whether it's commentators, whether it's journalists, everybody, within society seems to now accept that as a result of foreign policy. I mean, you think about it, whether it's, a preacher or somebody goes into a Muslim area, no preacher or anyone can go into a Muslim area and say, oh, because, we don't like the fact that British people drink, or because they go out on a Saturday night, or because, they eat fish and chips, that we should strap on some explosives and get onto a bus. It's not a justification, but the only way that would get people angry is if somebody, they would get, those people would get, beaten up themselves and thrown out of the area. But if someone goes and is talking about what's happening in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, in Palestine, these are the reasons why people get angry. I have to keep repeating, this is not a justification in any way, but that's the reasons why the anger is there. And people are, our survey again demonstrates, that I think a few percentage of people, but people are not against British values and democracy and freedom. This is a red herring. If Muslims were, last point, if it was the case that, all these Muslim extremists were against British values or Western values, why isn't Amsterdam the first place to get attacked?
I can assure you that you made a mistake there. The radicalisation of Muslim youth in Amsterdam is exceedingly worrying. Theo van Gogh was beheaded on the streets of Amsterdam by a young Muslim youth, working from a terror cell based in Amsterdam that fortunately was prevented before it blew up the headquarters of the Dutch intelligence service, the Dutch parliament, and Amsterdam airport.
I was going to say, I think...
Okay, now to make my next point on that, I think it's very important to stress two things on this. Firstly, this false notion that everything about foreign policy is behind us. One of the interesting things, perhaps the most interesting thing in the Policy Exchange report, was the analysis of what young Muslims in the survey knew. So all of the blowhard stuff about, I am doing this for my Muslim brethren in Palestine, do you know what tiny percentages of them could even name the Palestinian Prime Minister? The tiny number of them that could name Ehud Olmert. The tiny number that I think could even locate these areas on the map. This is a great problem at the moment because demagogic Muslim leaders and others are taking advantage of their opinions. They are telling them they should be enraged about this, that their Muslim brothers are being abused, and that they should be more angry. And a lot of them think in response, yeah, I'll wind myself up about it, and I'll wind other people up about it. But do they ever bother to know anything about it? Do they ever bother to find out? Do they even satiate even basic curiosity? No. And one other thing that comes from this that ought to be said, has to be said now, is this. What if this were to do with foreign policy? I don't think it is. But what if it were to do with foreign policy? So what? So what? Is the British state going to take dictation for its foreign policy from a tiny community within its midst? I don't think so.
Nobody's asking for a pro-Muslim foreign policy, a Muslim-friendly policy. What people want is a just foreign policy, a principled foreign policy, not one
that overthrew tyrants who were persecuting Muslim people in, for instance, Iraq. In
terms of what you were saying about Muslims not being aware of what's going on in Palestine, that's absolute nonsense. Muslims throughout are more politically aware today than they've ever been, whether it's about Iraq, and you don't have to know. You don't have to know who's the president of Iraq or of Palestine, whether to feel.
One thing. Okay.
If you was to ask the people in Britain who's the president of the Palestinian Authority or Israel, I'm pretty sure.
Hold on one second. Let's just look at the education issue for one thing. I mean, it is true, Craig, isn't it? Now, you were ambassador in a pretty far-off place. Most people won't have any clue what's going on in Uzbekistan, now, then, any point in time. It is true that there's a certain lack of education, for example, about what goes on in Egyptian jails, in Syrian jails, what life is like in Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth. That's true. People don't really know the reality of that. That's not really being taught. So when people do come up with issues of, well, my brethren are being persecuted, for example, it's rather sort of gut feeling, isn't it, rather than based on fact?
Well, yes, no. I mean, the truth is that in Uzbekistan, we and the Americans were supporting a terrible dictator, just as bad as Saddam Hussein.
Which you quite rightly
arguably was. And that's the hypocrisy of a policy, if you like. And if we had a general policy of being against dictators in general, then, and the Saddam Hussein thing fitted into that context, you might understand it. But the fact is that we were supporting a dictator who practiced torture. And not only that, but under the extraordinary rendition program, we were complicit in the sending of people abroad in order to be tortured. And I think there's a real danger that we have lost the kind of the moral high ground, and we've lost...
Who to?
Well, to no one, sadly. I'm not claiming anyone else is more moral than we are, but we are undoubtedly much less moral than we were. I know, for example, nowadays we accept intelligence obtained under torture. I worked on Iraq during the first Gulf crisis, and I know for a fact that under the then government, led at the time by Mrs. Thatcher, we would not accept intelligence under torture because it arose. Some of these grievances are real. It in no way justifies terrorism. I'm not saying it does. But to pretend that Muslim people don't have real grievances doesn't help the argument.
Fine. Well, one final point. The debate's been flying so quick and fast. We haven't gone to normal pieces. A final point for you, Ruhul. I mean, I think people should read your survey. I think it'd be very good to do so.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'd like to say. I mean, if you go to www.blink.org.uk, I mean, the survey's there. You can download it. It's a PDF version. And we would ask people just to have a look at that survey and see what the findings of that were. Thank
Douglas, last thought.
Well, I mean, as I say, I come back to this thing, which is that even if any of these complaints were true, which they're not, even if they were true, at the moment the Prime Minister goes to Her Majesty the Queen to ask permission to use her armed forces, are we really going to go to the Muslim Council of Britain to ask permission?
I think probably not. That was their view. This was Worldview. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks.